All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Rippon. I'm the director for the Center for Active Living at ACCA, Council on Aging. And I'm so glad Cloud Conrad's back with us again for part 2 of our 3-part series on the changes dementia brings. So Cloud, if you're new to Cloud, she is a dementia caregiver training specialist, certified coach, Alzheimer's Association community educator and support group facilitator, also a 2-time family dementia caregiver, which is really great. She has that personal connection to this topic as well. And also the author of a new book, The Dementia Field Guide, which is available on her website, and it's a great resource. And there it is. Yeah, it's such a great book and so important for folks to have all the resources they can get. So welcome, Cloud. Nice to see you again.
Thanks, Alan.
And I know in our first session, we talked a little bit about, what's normal aging, what's not normal aging. And then you gave us a tool that we can do for self-assessment for ourselves or for someone we may think in our family may benefit from a little more inquiry into that. And today, I think we're going to do a little bit more. So once there has been a diagnosis or there has been one for a little bit, helping caregivers set a plan for themselves, well, for their loved one, but also themselves as they go through this journey. So yeah, happy to pass it over to you and tell us more.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you again, Alan. Really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now and we will dive into the material. With any luck, you are seeing my title slide?
Yes.
Excellent. So as Alan said, this is part 2 in the Changes Dementia Brings Family Caregivers Primer. So this is really aimed at family caregivers. Whether or not there is a diagnosis, once a family is certain that dementia is in play, then this is information that will help support everyone in the family, frankly, and those that are most involved in caregiving primarily. Our information this morning is going to follow a certain path that I'll lay out for you right now, and then we'll dig in. The first is inconclusive evidence, and that might seem like a murky topic, and I will explain what that means in just a moment. Then we'll talk about preparing for the conversation. If a loved one, if you believe a loved one does indeed have some form of cognitive impairment, following the diagnostic path to determine whether or not it's dementia or to rule out dementia and discover some other cause for the signals that you are observing. Creating a family care plan if dementia is indeed in play. Information that will cover self-care for caregivers, very important topic, perhaps the most important topic today. And then finally some room in the end for questions if you have some. Let's get going. Alan already introduced me, so I will skip over this slide, only to say that this topic is very, very personal to me, twice a family caregiver. If you did not attend last time, you may not know that I felt so much fear, frustration, and failure when I was caregiving that I vowed one day to help other caregivers navigate their journey with more confidence and competence than I felt in that moment. Okay, what does inconclusive evidence mean? What this means is, last time, as Alan said, we talked about signals that may identify that some cognitive impairment is indeed present in yourself or a loved one. However, I want to stress again that there are many, many, many look-alike symptoms to dementia, and we want to remain uncertain about the whether or not dementia is present until we have some form of diagnosis, or unless it's unassailable. You're receiving unassailable evidence. Some of the look-alike symptoms. We talked last time about some of the ways that normal aging can look like dementia, specifically word loss, some forgetfulness, some being slower to process information. That is part of normal aging, and so we don't want to be certain until we get a medical professional involved that dementia is in play, and we don't want to presuppose this to our loved one. We are not qualified to make a diagnosis or to feel certain about what we're observing. Some other look-alike symptoms: depression, hearing loss, vision loss. Some of the misunderstandings that may occur with dementia may indeed be because someone is having problems with their hearing, and perhaps a hearing aid could alleviate that problem and minimize any misunderstandings. Excessive alcohol consumption, vitamin deficiencies, hypothyroidism, unremitting pain, and even the interactions of medicines that a person is on may cause some of the symptoms of dementia. And so we want to be certain that we remain uncertain, particularly when we're discussing this with our loved one. And finally, I would say that it is best for your relationship to your loved one, whether it's a spouse, a sibling, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin. It's best that you leave the dirty work, so to speak, to a third-party person. Let the doctor be the bad guy. And we'll talk about this conversation, as I alluded to, in the learning objectives prior to. Let someone else deliver the bad news. It is important to pursue a diagnostic path if you do see these signals, because if it is a treatable medical condition or disorder, why would we want to go ahead and help our person receive treatment and restore their well-being and their quality of life? We are in pursuing the diagnostic path. I counsel my clients to approach this with their loved one as ruling out dementia. Let's discover what it is so we can get it treated. In fact, don't even bring dementia up. Just, I'm noticing these changes, and we'll talk about preparing for that conversation momentarily. But definitely we would want to treat any medical conditions that we could. It's a good idea for everyone who's 65 plus to establish a baseline of cognitive ability, because as we discussed last time, the cognitive changes that occur with normal aging and with not normal aging tend to occur at such a slow rate that it's difficult to notice over time that a change has been made, because we adjust to a new normal. And so if we do have a baseline established, then it's easier to compare next year to this year to see if any kind of changes have indeed occurred. Now, if there is ultimately a diagnosis of dementia, one would be able to access drugs which may temporarily alleviate some of the symptoms. Without a diagnosis, one would not be able to receive a prescription for these drugs. Also, if there is indeed a diagnosis for dementia, one would be able to gain access to clinical trials, which may or may not involve some medications that may help a person. Certainly, we need clinical trials in order for the medical community to test new theories and new avenues that may lead to effective preventative treatments and cures for Alzheimer's and other dementia. We will never have preventative treatments and cures without clinical trials. And also, if diagnosis is indeed dementia, that allows time and knowledge for the family to do some family planning. Caregiving for a person with dementia can be very disruptive to the family and to the primary caregivers in that family. People may need to adjust their work hours. People may need to move to a different state in order to be able to care more effectively for a family member. So having that knowledge early really helps to facilitate a smoother transition into the caregiving role. And then finally, when a person is in the earliest stages of dementia, they are still maybe not entirely independent, but they are still nearly independent in many ways. And so perhaps the diagnosis may be a call to action for the family to work on some of the bucket list items for a person with dementia. So for example, if the person has always wanted to go to Madrid, if the person is in the early stages when they've received their diagnosis, they may very well have plenty of cognitive skill in order to travel safely and enjoy the trip to Madrid. Now, let's talk about preparing for the conversation a little bit. So let's say you did notice during the last talk that we that we had together about the 30 warning signals of potential dementia, you did notice some signs that in your loved one. How do you broach the subject of, let's go get this checked out? So now we'll talk about preparing for that conversation. And we want to map out the conversation ahead of time. It's advisable that we not take on this conversation in an extemporaneous way, in a just shoot from the hip kind of unprepared way. We want to make sure that we've considered who should have the conversation, when the conversation should occur, where that conversation should be conducted, what is the substance of that conversation, and how do we go about achieving the success of getting that person onto a diagnostic path. So the first thing that we'll talk about is who. I want to stress that this is very unlike an intervention in the situation where a family member has an addiction problem. This is not family members sitting around a circle with a suitcase packed. This is nothing like that at all. This is very much an individual one-on-one conversation that loved ones should have. It should be structured as a one-on-one. If all of the daughters have discovered or have noticed signs in their father, for example, that cognitive impairment may be in play, all daughters should have a conversation, but not together and not back to back either. We don't want to seem like we're ganging up. We don't want our concern to be misinterpreted as ganging up, teaming up against dad. Any family member who's observed changes should plan to have a conversation. And I will call back to the last session that we had together to remind you of and reinforce you of the lenses through which we would determine if a sign of cognitive impairment is indeed cause for concern. So are those signs different from before and different for that person? Are those signs lapses from which the loved one is unable to recover? If I forget my high school teachers, I think this was the example I gave last time, if I forget my daughter's high school teacher's name when I see her down at the other end of the aisle in the grocery store and we have a conversation and I'm thinking to myself, what is her name? What is her name? What is her name? We have the conversation just fine. I'm driving home from the grocery store and I remember, her name is Jan. That is an example of recovering. Or when someone has the word on the tip of their tongue, maybe it's not a pronoun or someone's name, maybe it's just a word, a noun, typically, and they can't come up with that word in the moment in that conversation, but later they remember that word. Then that is an example of recovering. If I don't remember when I leave the house in the morning that I have a dentist appointment at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but during lunch I'm eating my lunch and I'm thinking, oh wait, I have a dentist appointment at 3. That's recovering from that lapse or from that forgotten appointment. And also that they are more than just senior moments in the sense that they happen often enough that they begin to interfere with daily living. It's not just a senior moment that happens, once or twice a week and may be inconvenient, but is not happening frequently enough. So that's who. Anyone who's observed changes in a loved one which satisfy these three lens questions. When should this conversation occur? When both parties, the loved one you've observed the changes in and you, are well rested, well fed, not distracted by other people, things, concerns, and emotions. There should not be a television program on in the background. There may or may not be music. If it is music, it should be soothing music, perhaps instrumental music without words so that there can be minimal distractions. Also, choose a time when you're not likely to be interrupted by scheduling demands, such as, whoops, well, let's cut this conversation short because it's time for me to go to the dentist. So when there's plenty of time to have the conversation, you have an open-ended period of time that's not chopped off at the end by any finite appointment or scheduling matter. Where the environment is comfortable, private, where there's a lack of distraction, once again, and not likely to be interrupted by other people. So for example, it's probably not a good idea to decide to have this conversation in a restaurant, because the waitress or waiter is going to be coming up, refilling the water, asking how's the food, do you need anything else? And that can be very problematic in this sort of conversation, because it is, frankly, an emotionally charged conversation. What is the substance of this conversation? We want to talk about some of the changes that we've noticed, but we want to be accurate about the changes that we've noticed, but not accusatory. So for example, if someone is more forgetful and not really recovering from those memory lapses, we don't want to position it as, you forgot about your dentist appointment yesterday. We want to be softer than that, and not accusatory, and not point these out as things that can be corrected or should be corrected. We want to exhibit our concern. We want to be direct but not derogatory or talk down to the person. And we want to position what we say as exploring treatable conditions. In fact, I counsel many of my clients not to even bring up the word dementia, but exploring treatable conditions, something that we can treat. Let's go get it treated. Why wouldn't we want to treat something that we can treat? And also, we might want to mention that while we're at the doctor's, since we're both over 65 now, or since you're over 65, Medicare will include, and Medicaid will pay for a cognitive screening. So let's go establish a baseline so we can be prepared to discover any changes that may or may not occur later down the road. And then how do we have this conversation? I recommend 5 talking points, and here they are. I've noticed a change. What I've noticed is you seem a little more forgetful than you used to be. So different from before, different for that person. I'm concerned, and here's why. And then what this might be is, and here's where we go back to treatable diseases. Maybe you're under a lot of stress, and that's why you've been a little more forgetful lately. I've noticed we've had more misunderstandings lately than we had in the past. I'm wondering if this might be something with your hearing. Let's get it checked out. I'll go with you. If at all possible, try to identify some other cause other than dementia, because it is very, very, very unlikely that your loved one, when you say, I think you have dementia, is going to say, oh, you're right. Well, I should give up driving. Here's the keys. You drive me to the doctor. That just never happens. Dementia is a very daunting topic. Dementia invites denial because it is such a daunting topic. So if we can stay away from dementia and keep it to safer subjects that are treatable medical conditions, then we might have more success in this conversation. Once we go to the doctor, we'll begin trying to discover what the cause of what you've noticed is, and along the way, we may be able to rule out dementia, or we may discover, and it's the doctor's bad news, that it is not a hearing problem that a hearing aid will cure. So let's get it checked out. I'll go with you. And I recommend to my clients that they write this out. The act of writing will force you to choose the words that are most appropriate for what you've noticed, and most appropriate for the situation, and most appropriate for the personality and of your loved one and the dynamics of your relationship. So I've noticed a change. What is the change that you've noticed? Hearken back to the signals that we talked about last time. Here's what I've noticed. I'm concerned, and here's why. This could be affecting, and here's why. This could be affecting quality of life. That's always a good thing to say. Your well-being. This may be affecting our relationship. Those are all safe things to say. What this might be is, and the answer can always be, something that we can treat if we can see a doctor about it. I think we should go get it checked out. I'll go with you. And so the we and I, the we language here is very important. You and I together. And this is very truthful, because if it is indeed dementia, family members are affected too. So it is very much a we situation, not a you situation. A little more about say this, not that. Instead of getting a diagnosis, and I've suggested it in the previous slides, let's get things checked out. Seems a lot more innocuous. It won't cause a person to blow up, to be resistant, to be defensive, or to trigger denial. Instead of medical opinion, which sounds a lot like diagnosis or second opinion, medical advice, or even simply advice. Instead of you messages, which can be accusatory in nature, I and we messages. That is indicating that you are, as a caregiver or potential caregiver, are there to support your loved one. You don't understand my point. This may come up in the conversation because it may trigger denial or resistance in some form, or, well, you do it too, you forget about dentist appointments too, or what have you. Instead of you don't understand my point, simply we see it differently. That just diffuses the situation, and it doesn't make anybody right or wrong, or good or bad. And then in the case of other family members, there may be denial as well. Or this may be a dynamic with the loved one with whom you've noticed these signals. I had a client who her sister was in strong denial about their mother's cognitive impairment, and so my client had been Xeroxing articles or copying articles and sending them to her sister that were discussing some of the problems that they were observing in their mother. And she would put post-its on it and to say, see, this proves mom has dementia. And that denial is something that we overcome at our own pace. And so rather than telling someone that they're wrong and you're right by saying, see, this proves it, to put more information in front of other people with denial so that they can have the space to reach conclusions themselves. When we think an idea is our own, we're a lot more enamored with it than if we think an idea is someone else's and it's a difficult topic. So my client started writing, I thought this was interesting on the top of the article, eliminating the post-it altogether. So there was no flag, and just I thought this was interesting. So leaving space for her sister to come to her own clarity in her own space and time. And now a little bit about what the diagnostic path may look like. I again mentioned before that once a person reaches the age of 65, it is included in insurance coverage, this cognitive wellness exam that would be conducted in the primary care physician's office. Now, let me say, I've seen research that suggests that the majority of physicians believe that having conversations with their older clients are important. Having conversations about dementia and Alzheimer's are important. But however, that the majority of doctors do not actually have that conversation with their patients. It's unclear from the research that I've seen the reasons that they aren't having these conversations. Maybe there's not time in the visit. We know how rushed doctor's appointments can be at this point in our healthcare system today. But make sure that this cognitive exam, this cognitive evaluation, it's a very simple tool that a primary care physician would use, but make sure that's included as part of the visit. It's advised that you, as a family member, contact the primary care physician ahead of time and say, you know, I'm kind of noticing some things in my husband or my father, and I'm going to schedule an appointment and I'm going to come too, but I just wanted you to know ahead of time because it's not really something I want to discuss when we're all in the room together, because my husband, my father, you know, seems to be resistant to this topic, but would you please be sure and conduct the cognitive exam and position it as a baseline, that we're establishing a baseline so we can make sure that if changes do occur later, that we have a baseline to compare that to so we can have some clarity about what's really happening. You may believe that your loved one is depressed, and perhaps that is a reason for some of the signs and symptoms that you've seen. So there are other reasons why you may want to contact the doctor ahead of time to request that he perform lab work or screen for depression. And also to suggest that if the doctor is observing the same things that you are, that perhaps he might make a referral to a specialist if needed. After the primary care physician, it's entirely likely, because what we talked about with lookalike symptoms, that a specialist will need to be seen to identify whether or not the clumsiness, for example, is the cause of something going on with vision itself, not visual processing, but vision itself, that may be addressed with glasses, or may be addressed with some kind of medication. For example, if glaucoma is in the picture, or macular degeneration. So it may be that the primary care physician is referring your loved one on to an eye doctor or an audiologist. Again, misunderstandings can often be because a person is not receiving the visual data in order to process it accurately. It may be a psychologist, particularly in the case of depression that looks like dementia. It may be a gerontologist or a neurologist. But we want to start with trying to identify treatable conditions once again and get them treated. And if we're not able in the diagnostic path to identify those, then we may discover that it is dementia. But by the time that person is on the diagnostic path, and we've been attempting to rule out other conditions but unable to rule out other conditions, the person may come to their own awareness, either express that to you or develop it privately that something else is going on, and they may be able to prepare themselves emotionally or not. The emotions of a person who's going through this diagnostic path are very fragile, and particularly in the early stages of dementia, if there is indeed a diagnosis, the emotions of a person are very fragile. So we want to be very careful and mindful of that fragility, and leave room for that, to forgive outbursts that may occur as a result of the emotions surrounding a diagnosis. For caregivers, creating a family plan and self-care for caregivers are the next pieces of content that we will cover here. And creating a family plan is a very important part of the family's path through a person's progression with dementia. So we want to map this out, and we want to think in very clear and finite terms about what a family plan will look like. So if you are going to be the primary caregiver, who besides you can also support caregiving? What can continue for the person living with dementia, and until when? And establishing a routine, preparing a personal fact sheet, and then identifying a legacy project. And I'll go into a little detail on all of these matters right now. The first thing I want to stress is that dementia caregiving is more intense. And in the early stages of dementia caregiving, it is much less intense. But because dementia is a neurodegenerative disease with a progression that is one in decline, then caregivers' role in caregiving will become more and more intense over time. This is a comparison that came through the National Alliance for Caregivers and AARP, some joint research that they did together. And it's comparing dementia caregiving with caregiving for older folks that have some other illness but no cognitive impairment. So the dark blue lines that or columns that you see here rather are caregivers of people with Alzheimer's or other dementia. And then the ones that are mint green, those columns are caregivers of people who have a loved one who have no cognitive impairment. And the first two, so it's comparing the percentage of caregivers who provide these sorts of caregiving activities. On the bottom row, left to right, are the caregiving activities, and then on the vertical axis here, the percentage of people that provide that kind of care. So getting in and out of beds and chairs, not very different for people with dementia versus people with other illnesses. Getting dressed, a little bit more different, but not that different. Bathing or showering, here's a stark difference between the percentage of caregivers who provide this activity for those living with dementia versus other forms of care. Another stark difference, feeding. A great deal more dementia caregivers are providing feeding assistance. And then dealing with incontinence, an incredible stunning difference in the number of caregivers providing that activity for those living with dementia versus those with other health issues. So it is an intense form of caregiving, and the intensity increases over time. The point of this slide is to say, because it is so intense, you will need some fellow caregivers to help support you. The intensity of dementia caregiving puts caregivers at a greater risk of depression, disease, and even death. And so that is how intense dementia caregiving is. So who can help you? If you have someone to support you in dementia caregiving, then you are less at risk of developing depression, disease, or even death. On the average, there are somewhere between 2 and 3 people in the family, unpaid caregivers, for each person living with dementia. You deserve to have another person or 2 helping you in dementia caregiving, and you not only deserve it, you need that team to support you. So thinking now about who can help you. Maybe you don't need that assistance immediately if your loved one is in the early stages of dementia, but thinking now about who that's going to be and planning for that. What kind of skills should each of these team members develop, and what strengths can each team member bring? With my father, my 2 sisters and I, we're very close as sisters, but we're very different people. And so we each sort of focused on our superpowers. I was more wired like my father, so I was better gifted to provide emotional support for him, whereas my older sister is more wired for business and has a very great business mind. And so she was the one who could navigate insurance, and eventually when we got him into a living facility and all of those kinds of things, which you say insurance to me and I just glaze over. But I could handle the emotional piece of it. And my younger sister is an attorney and was very gifted at helping my father determine his estate planning and those sorts of things. So consider what strengths each of you on the caregiving team roster can provide, and let people focus on their superpowers and divide, a division of labor that way can certainly help. We were all involved in a hands-on way, but those were each of our strengths. And even though perhaps you don't need to engage siblings or spouses in the caregiving of a parent, or other family members in the caregiving of a loved one, maybe you don't need to engage them today. But as I mentioned before, if caregiving is going to change, may have profound changes on caregivers' lives, such as changing work hours, or even retiring, or going down to part-time, or moving out of state, or having mom come live in one of the children's homes, then it's a good idea to decide that information, decide those answers as soon as possible, even though you may not be taking action right away. Knowledge is power, and so the more knowledge we have, the better able we will be to execute a successful caregiving plan. What can continue? Usually a diagnosis does occur at some point in the early stage of dementia when a person isn't dependent on loved ones entirely. So much can continue. I mentioned before bucket list items. Those should definitely be things that can continue and should be acted upon while the loved one with cognitive impairment still has as much cognitive ability, the maximum cognitive ability that they will ever have again to enjoy and engage with those activities. Also, it's time to identify a legacy project, and I'll give you more specifics about that in a moment, but so that the loved one with cognitive impairment can have input into their legacy project, can have input into the bucket list items, and even can have input into the family caregiving plan. And then until when? So agree early on about when certain activities should be discontinued and why, because of course skill level will progress in a declining rate, not rapidly, but it will be progressing in a declining rate. So some of the obvious safety matters that we should consider are driving and cooking. We don't necessarily have to say, well, when are you going to stop playing golf or oil painting or participating in your book club, but 2 key matters to have some clarity on are driving and cooking. And I suggest to my clients that they have a conversation about driving with their loved one, but that they do it in a way that makes it impersonal, that doesn't make it about their loved one. So for example, instead of saying, well, when do you think you should quit driving? What are the signs when you should, hand over your keys? You might say something like, well, let's suppose this was our neighbor Fred and his wife. And let's say Stella, his wife, is the one with cognitive impairment. How should Fred approach this? And what kind of conversation should they have together? And when should it be that Stella should give up her keys? So get your loved one's input, but in a way that doesn't make it so much about them, that makes it impersonal and a third person, more of a hypothetical conversation. And then you've got that knowledge of, okay, here's the threshold that we can agree on is the moment when you should really stop driving, or even before that, when you should restrict your driving to church and the golf course and maybe the grocery store, the beaten paths. And the same thing with cooking, because of course a fire can start if someone is not mindful of what's in the oven or on the stove. Consider ways to document this agreement about where those thresholds are. And as you're having the conversation, stress that this threshold is down the road. It may be right there, but usually in this conversation, that threshold is down the road. But documenting the when that threshold is going to occur. I've had some clients have success with their person can be very rational and think about it from a very logical standpoint, because it's down the road, saying, well, when I forget to use my turn signals, or when I have a fender bender, or when I can no longer, remember where the car keys are. I don't know what those thresholds are. Only you will be able to identify those. But I've had clients actually take their phone and say, okay, I'm going to record you saying this so we can remember later what this threshold is. So we can remember later, both of us, what this threshold is. Are you ready to be recorded? So tell me during the recording when that threshold is. Now that might be too... that might seem too strong for some of you. Maybe it's a written, contract of sorts. Maybe that word is too strong, but just a written statement that the person can sign that you can show them later to say, we agreed that this was the point when you would stop driving, and we've reached that point. And the person says, oh, no, we haven't. And then here comes the piece of paper, or here comes the video. No, we agreed, remember? And you've got that piece of evidence. Taking away the keys is a very difficult conversation. It's a very difficult moment in a family relationship. Some people avoid taking away the keys by getting under the hood when their person is not looking and removing a critical component of the engine, or letting air out of the tires, or siphoning off gas so that there is no more gas in the tank. There are other ways besides, hand over your keys to get a person to stop driving. But a very important conversation to have. Until when? Another thing I want to suggest to you is establishing a routine. And I counsel my clients to develop a daily list. And so the daily list offers the routine, it offers the familiarity, it allows us to stay on track if we have to go to the dentist this afternoon and all of a sudden it comes time to leave, and your loved one no longer wants to go to the dentist and is, having a bit of an outburst about that. So on the daily list that I counsel my clients to use, something we have to do, that might be going to the dentist. We agree that we're going to accomplish this together today, and it is usually something that's less desirable. Maybe your father needs to be shaved, or it is the dentist, or we have to go to the grocery store, or we have to endure Aunt Mary's visit. But we agree that we're going to endure that, we're going to get through it, we're going to accomplish it together. Something you, loved one with dementia, want to do, that's that person's special request, and it's often positioned as the reward for having gotten back from the dentist or enduring Aunt Mary's visit. I'm kind of joking with that one, but it may be a very real phenomenon for many families there. So position that one as a reward, and then something I, the caregiver, want to do, which is the special request of the caregiver. It's your reward for enduring that thing together. And you agree also during this list that you're getting to do that activity may take you away for a little while from your loved one. If you are going to yoga class, or maybe you're going to see a social worker to help you work through some of the emotions associated with caregiving, or maybe you're attending a support group. Familiarity is very comforting, not just an established routine, such as having coffee at the same time in the morning, or having the same thing for breakfast, or eating lunch at the same time. Familiarity in all cases is important. Seeing the same faces on a regular basis, being in the same environment on a regular basis, and having a routine that is expected and followed can be very comforting to a person with dementia. What is the personal fact sheet that I mentioned earlier? This is a gathering of information that can support all caregivers and even visitors and others that are introduced into the environment with a person with dementia that may help support them, knowledge to support them. So the personal fact sheet would list out all of the spouses, list out the full name of the spouse, the siblings, the children if present, alive and deceased, because a person with dementia may talk about deceased loved ones as if they are in the room or as if they are living today. And so if a visitor or a caregiver is aware, say a professional caregiver is aware that Sister Sue is deceased, but still a loved one, then they may be better able to engage with the person with dementia. Also, past experience is personal and professional, and these should include major life moments, because those often will come up in conversation. A person with dementia may bring them up in conversation, may reminisce about those moments, or caregivers can be supported in their engagement by bringing up happy major life moments, such as when children were born, when major promotions were achieved, when a person, was able to finally buy their first car with the money they'd earned from their summer job, those sorts of things. Also, preferences would include hobbies, foods, music, TV programs, that sort of thing. Of course, medical and legal information, such as who has power of attorney, who are the doctors, what are other medical conditions that are also involved and a part of caregiving, medications, doses, and conditions, and then also the legacy project details, because they can be things that all caregivers or visitors can help engage, help participate in to support a loved one, or they may simply be topics of conversation. After you develop the personal fact sheet, make several copies of it, distribute to each caregiver and family member, post a copy in a common living area. If things change, and this might be medications and doses or different doctors involved in caregiving, then update the personal fact sheet and redistribute to everyone involved. And keep spares on hand. So if your person needs to have a visit to the emergency room, it's a helpful tool to provide to the emergency medical technicians the personal fact sheet. They will be looking first and foremost for doctors and medications and conditions and doses, but the other information may help them to engage with and calm the person that they're caring for during that transport. What is a legacy project? A legacy project is something that honors the life of the person with dementia. It may be something like a photo album. It may be collected essays that the person has written. It may be a memoir that caregivers help the person with dementia write, or more simply an oral history, recording the person talking about, key moments in their life. It might be a craft project. Maybe if your mother is a quilter, maybe there are mini quilts that she makes with favorite fabrics that might be favorite outfits that she wore or not to distribute to family members later. It might be, so I had a client whose father was a woodworker, and he couldn't make tables and chests and chairs anymore, but he could still handle more simpler projects, and his family members could support him in making simpler projects. So he used some of the extra wood that he had left and made jewelry boxes for all of his children. Little dresser top jewelry boxes for all of his children. It may be something as simple as a playlist. Perhaps your loved one is a music aficionado, and perhaps this is a lot like those, essentials collections, like a classical essentials or Mozart essentials or jazz essentials. Maybe these are music that selections of music that your loved one enjoys so much that they want to share that joy of those selections with other family members. So it can be a complex project or it can be a very simple project, and that is for you to decide with your loved one. And it may be that initially the person with dementia can be very involved in the project, very hands-on, but as their progression unfolds, that caregivers become more and more hands-on. So always be certain to tailor the project to the person's level of skill. And the legacy project should be something that will make a difference as defined by the person with dementia. What that difference is, we don't know, but it's something that we want the person to feel a sense of purpose. That's a very important part of all of our human emotional needs, to feel that we have a sense of purpose and drive in life, and a feeling to feel that we belong. And so the legacy project is a nice tool to help people with dementia feel as if they still belong and can contribute, and therefore they have a purpose. Self-care for caregivers. Cannot stress enough how important self-care is for caregivers. There are 36 million Americans today that are 18 plus that are caring for an adult relative, and we discussed before the intensity of caregiving on family caregivers, unpaid caregivers. So 1 in 2 of those that are caring for an adult relative are caring for a parent. Instead of a parent, people may also be caring for a spouse, a grandparent, a sibling, or an aunt, uncle, or cousin, or in-law for that matter. Now, caregiving is very intense. And 1 in 2 caregivers, family caregivers, say that they feel lonely, that they are isolated in their caregiving. So this is a very common phenomenon. 50% of people say that they feel this loneliness. And of those who do, when I'm looking at the circle cluster on the right there, the blue or the teal circle there are those that say that they feel lonely. And then 70% of those, this white circle inside of that, represents, of those who feel lonely, 70% say that they experience high emotional stress as a result of their loneliness. 1 in 5 unpaid caregivers reports a decline in health. Looking at the circle cluster over here on the right, 60% of those in decline say that they are in a high intensity caregiving situation. We talked about some of those activities that might make dementia caregiving high intensity. And then looking at the circle cluster on the left, of those 20% who say that they feel in decline, 60% of those, that white circle inside the green one, represents, although it doesn't look quite like 60%, 60% in decline report having difficulty keeping up with self-care. That's not only grooming and physical self-care, but emotional self-care as well. And so it's very important that caregivers leave time and energy for self-care. I have a tool that can help caregivers gauge their self-care and their well-being, and I will share that tool with you in a moment. The tool measures 6 aspects of well-being as I see them. They are physical. These are kind of the obvious things: nutrition, exercise, staying hydrated, keeping a good sleep regimen, keeping up with oral hygiene. That's maybe not quite so obvious, but inflammation in the mouth can lead to inflammation in the brain. Plaque in the mouth can lead to plaque in the brain. Keeping up with proper medication regimens. And then from an environmental standpoint, an orderly, attractive, comforting space to be as a sanctuary inside and a sanctuary outdoors. It also should be free of any kind of safety risks. So from a cognitive standpoint, regular stimulation involving problem solving and new learning. Typically, caregivers find that they have less time to pursue their own hobbies and interests and goals. And it's important to, perhaps you can't pursue all of them during caregiving, but it's important to maintain pursuit of some of those important goals, hobbies, and pursuits. From a social standpoint, regular interaction with friends and family members who are positive, valued people in one's life, and reducing or eliminating interactions with those people who are toxic in one's life. From a value standpoint, this talks about a sense of self-esteem and valuing oneself and feeling valued by others. And then from a spiritual standpoint, the ability to maintain a connection to higher powers, whatever they may be, and or the universe. So these are the 6 aspects of well-being as I see them. And as I mentioned, they are what is measured in the well-being and self-care assessment that I've developed for my clients. As with the signals of cognitive decline assessment that we talked about last time, this assessment can be accessed through SurveyMonkey. The link for it is on the bottom of my screen here, surveymonkey.com/r/self-care-assessment. This survey is free access, and it's anonymous if you use this link. You can find access to it on my website, but from my website, it will ask for an email address in order before you are let into where this is in SurveyMonkey. But if you use this link, you'll be directly into the survey in SurveyMonkey without having to provide me an email address. It will take about 3 to 5 minutes to complete. Don't have to study it hard. Just kind of go with your instinct responses, your gut feel for where you are on 36 different aspects of well-being that fall under the 6 categories that we just went through. Once it's completed, you'll receive a tally immediately and a recommendation based on that tally or that score range. There are, as I mentioned, 6 aspects of self-care are explored, and you will be asked 6 questions for each. This is a sample question. The first question, or the first set of questions, relates to physical state. For each statement in the section, select the answer that is most true based on the last 14 days. All of the questions that are asked, we want you to answer based on what is most true for the last 2 weeks or 14 days. So this sample question is, I ate a balanced diet, including several servings of fresh fruit and vegetables daily. That was true for me usually, not all the time, but usually for me over the last 2 weeks. So if I was completing this, I would select usually, and then I would move on to the next question. So it's very simple to fill out, very easy to complete. And once again, that link is surveymonkey.com/r/self-care-assessment. Now, because caregiving will become more intense as the dementia progresses in your loved one, it's important that caregivers stay abreast of and engage in ongoing monitoring and maintenance of their self-care. So I've provided a tool as well for you. I will have Alan send this out to you later this afternoon to everyone who registered. I have provided this tool called the Well-Being Gauge, and there's also an action planning template that goes along with this. So if you've never seen a radar graph, there's a sample on the right for how I would fill that out. I would place a dot on each of these corners of the rings, that each corner as it correlated to one of those 6 aspects. So for physical, let's say I was kind of in the middle. I wasn't really eating fresh fruits and vegetables daily, for example, as normal. I'd kind of fallen off from that and almost did it only about half the time. So thinking about all the physical aspects of well-being, where am I today? And I would say, well, could be better, could be worse. I'm going to say I'm in the middle. So I placed that dot on one of the middle rings beneath the word physical. And then for environmental, I was even worse about that. This time, let a little bit more clutter build up in my house, for example. As far as cognitive activity, I was pretty strong on that. So I put my dot way out there towards the outer most ring. I should add, I didn't mention it, the outermost ring is the highest score you could give yourself, and the innermost ring is the lowest score you could give yourself. And I complete this for social and value and for spiritual. And then I draw lines to connect those dots, and I shade in that area in between, and I sit back and I ask myself, does the shape that I created cover more than 50% or less than 50% of that radar graph, of that well-being gauge? If it's less than 50%, then perhaps we might want to do some action planning around that particular aspect of well-being. So you'll also receive a template for you to conduct some action planning around any of the aspects that you identify using this well-being gauge that you've identified that you want to work on. You might write your intention. So maybe, for example, I'm going to stop eating ice cream at 10 o'clock at night. I'm going to stop that midnight snack. That'll help me be healthier and sleep better. So that was my intention. Cut out ice cream at 10 o'clock. Then some action details around that. How might I stop doing that? Is it lock up the refrigerator? Is it eat carrots instead? Is it select another activity to replace the ice cream? Or maybe it's a cup of chamomile tea. I don't know. But that's where you would write those action details. And then you would also write the next check-in date because, as I said, this is ongoing and we want to monitor it on a regular basis. I recommend for my clients that they check in with themselves every 2 or 3 months on a regular basis. Now, the information that I provide in the workbook to you, or the worksheets, includes original information, but I do give you permission to copy this page, make as many copies as you want so that you always have a fresh copy to work with each time you go to complete the well-being gauge for your ongoing monitoring and maintenance. And the last thing I'm going to suggest to caregivers, and we do have a minute or two for questions, is that you join a support group. A support group is a very, very, very important part of your caregiving plan. Support groups are attended by like-minded people who are in the similar situation, who know exactly what you're experiencing as a caregiver for a loved one. It's not really, the support group is facilitated by a professional, but really it is the support group members that provide advice and emotional support to each other. The support group can provide social engagement. You know, we talked about the dangers of feeling isolated in caregiving. A support group can provide you social engagement in a very supportive way, because you will be engaging with other people who know exactly what it's like to care for a person living with dementia. Support groups are social activity, and social activity is cognitive activity. When we're having conversation with other people, we're engaging multiple parts of our brain. That keeps us exercised in a cognitive way. And I will also suggest that the Athens Community Council for Aging, ACCA, provides a dementia caregiver support group from noon to 1 on the third Thursday of every month. It is back in, it was on Zoom, it was online in a virtual setting for, well, since we had to isolate for COVID back in March 2020. It's just as of this month starting to meet back up in person. And so next week, at noon, we'll begin the support group. Next week's date is the 16th of June. If you are not a member of that support group and you're interested, please mark that on your calendar. It's held at ACCA, which is at 135 Hoyt Street in Athens, Georgia. And I won't bother with the phone number here because you may or may not have a piece of paper to write that information down. But if you look up ACCA and you call them, ask for Robin. She is the support group facilitator, and she can give you more information about that support group. I have shadowed that support group for a year and a half now, and Robin is an excellent facilitator, and it's a great group of people, just a great group of people that attend that support group. And now I'm going to open it up for questions. If any of you would like to contact me after the fact with any questions or comments, my email address is cloud@newstreetcompass.com. And once again, the link to that self-care assessment is www.surveymonkey.com/r/self-care-assessment. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, let's try to address them now.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you. This is extremely helpful. My mother died 2 months ago. She lived in Arizona with her husband, my stepfather, and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 4 years ago. He's progressing very slowly, kind of mild now. I'm the only family there is. He doesn't have any close friends, and being 2,000 miles away is difficult. 2 years ago, his neurologist recommended that he not drive unless somebody was in the car with him. And, that's not possible anymore, but he's still driving. And I'm also the power of attorney for financial matters as well as healthcare. I'm concerned about that, and I'm not sure how far to push it. I suggested that he give me access to his bank accounts and stuff like that on the website. I can, look at it. And he doesn't want to do that. He doesn't think it's needed.
Okay.
He can handle it himself now. Over the last couple of years, he has had some problems, but nothing really bad happened. And I'm wondering, but he's managing okay now. He hasn't gotten in a wreck, so he's getting by driving, although it was advised against it. I suggested that he move. He's in a continuing care facility now with all levels of care. It's in a pretty good place. I suggested that he move to one here, and he doesn't want to. He's very happy where he is, but he thinks that sometime down the future, when he needs it, he may want to move. My concern is as he gets older, it'll be more difficult to move emotionally and physically because, change is hard for him already. So I'm kind of don't know if I should just kind of not worry about it, or if you think I should kind of press one or two of these issues with him.
Thank you so much for your question, Robert. So I heard concerns about, as power of attorney, concerns about money management, that it might not be that there might not be problems now, but he's resistant, and you feel that over time it's going to be important for you to have access. And then I also heard that he is resistant to move closer to you now, but acknowledges that the time may come for that later. Do I have that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
My concern with the money is I can go on the website now because I'm on his bank accounts, but I don't know what it means. I see that every month he has a debit for this and a debit for that, a credit for that. And I don't know what it is. And I thought if he could explain them all to me now, that would be good, because sometime later on, when he's willing for me to help, he may not remember all those.
Oh, I see. Okay. So nothing alarming for you. You just would like to understand, and it's not drastic spending, but you would like to understand what the habits are so you'll know if there's a change later?
Yeah, I don't think he's doing anything wrong now, but I'm afraid if he waits too long, he may have a difficult time explaining to me what everything means.
And that is a very good anticipation on your part, a very astute anticipation on your part. Maybe an avenue to try, since he's resistant now to explaining those things or having that conversation with you, might be related to elder scams and ransomware. I was watching 60 Minutes last night and learning. I don't know if you saw if you saw that episode. They did a piece on ransomware, and they talked about the Atlanta attack. That's Athens is close to Atlanta, and they talked about the pipeline attack and things like that. And they're saying that it's not that far off that ransomware people will be able to reach into your and my bank accounts. And so perhaps maybe the angle would be, that you've been doing research because of these ransomware attacks, and it's really important to make sure that nothing is happening in his account, and can you go through that together? That may be an angle. That it's not that way. It's not about his ability or inability or your asking what is this, what is that, in a way would be or could be perceived as judgmental of his spending. It's more about protection and the bad guys and making sure that nothing is happening along those lines. I almost was victim to a scam myself earlier this week. It was a separate scenario where Bank of America was calling me. The point that I'm making is that the scammers have gotten so good at copying artwork and copying audio files and making things look so much like a tried and trusted, true entity, that it's helpful for, people to look over each other's shoulders and question, maybe the word isn't question, but to go through banking activity to make sure everything is as it looks, because it's easy for people who are older to not recognize things that are nefarious.
Do you think it may be a good time now to approach it a little bit more rather than waiting until a problem?
I would try. If you still get resistance, you can only press to a certain point. If you do have the ability to see the activity now, so if you're not able to have the conversations that you would really like to have with them, at least you will be able to, you do have the ability to monitor and notice yourself when and if spending patterns change in a way that could be related to his cognitive ability, or could be related to some kind of scamming activity.
And the suggestion that you made before regarding driving, if forgetting to use turn signals, get a little bit lost or something like that. He's in a self-monitoring situation, so could something like that really work if he has to monitor himself?
Well, that's going to be more difficult because his own awareness of his monitoring is going to change. And whether or not he admits that, if he is aware and admits it to you, is a whole other question as well, because of course driving is one's control, asserting control and independence in their life still. It's still worth having the conversation about and trying to make it hypothetical. When should a person curtail their driving altogether, or when should a person, restrict their driving to only essential places and the ones that that they're most familiar with? You may or may not succeed with that. But to have that conversation to find out where he is about, and does he see a threshold that he may approach at some point in the future where it would be the safe and wise thing to do. And this may be a conversation to have with someone on the care planning team in his assisted living community as well.
Well, thank you very much. That's real helpful.
Yes, and are they having with you, the care planning team at the community? Are they having with you quarterly meetings where they're talking about his physical abilities and his diet and exercise and cognitive abilities and the like?
No, they're not. He's in the independent living area now.
Oh, okay, you did mention
They
that.
kind of have a hands-off perspective until he moves into assisted living or Alzheimer's, which I don't know when that'll be.
Maybe have a conversation with the coordinator who facilitated his move-in to begin with about who's going to decide that, when it's time for him to move on, and try to get some clarity about that.
I went there to visit 2 months ago, right before my mother died, and I met with the social worker there.
Okay.
We was really talking about my stepfather, not my mother, with her. And so I've had one contact with her, so I think what you're suggesting is a good idea.
Yes, someone should be your eyes and ears, so to speak, because again, whether or not, he just may not be aware of changes that are happening, and whether or not he's aware and discusses them with you is another matter. So you do need the eyes and ears of someone there. And I should have said at the very beginning, Robert, I'm sorry for your loss in your mother.
No, thank you.
Very sorry for your loss.
I'm sorry to hear that, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions. They're great. This is such a great presentation. There's so much detail, and I think I especially love the communication piece of like how
Yeah,
to,
this is really great. I kind of feel bad that more people weren't on it because I'm
I
sure
just
this
feel
is
like
great for
everybody
a lot
should
of
watch
people.
this. I know. Well, we're going to share it afterwards, so there's another chance for folks. But did have a couple quick questions. So, who should be on the care team? I know you had a slide with different specialists and talking specifically about within the family. But I know that's such a challenge for people to feel overwhelmed by like who's on the team and how do I even go about putting a team together? What would you say about that?
Everyone who can from the family perspective, and it may not be that all family members are hands-on. For example, I have a client who she's in charge of the emotional and she's the day-to-day and the practical person, but there's a sibling living out of state who does all of the insurance filing and all of the medical figuring out and that sort of thing. So not all caregivers have the same role, but everyone who can participate should participate. Does that help?
Yeah, and just in terms of medically, so it's almost like you have your primary doctor, you have
Oh,
your neurologist, you have maybe a you know, just the different. Maybe there's a social worker, maybe there's the support group. Just, I mean, you've sort of said it all, but just, you know, where do people start? Is it just going, you know, starting with the doctor or starting with the.
thank you for that. Start with the primary care physician, who would be the person likely to refer out to other specialists. And that would include, you know, ruling out or ruling in hearing loss, you know, as the problem that's causing the signals, if the signals that family members are observing. If it is indeed dementia, the neurologist should be on that caregiving team. They are likely going to be the one who may prescribe medications, would be the neurologist. Certainly the neurologist should be on that team. If there is hearing loss that contributes to misunderstandings and the like, but is distinct from the dementia, that person should be on the caregiving team. As dementia progresses, the medical team will, or the professional team, let's put it that way, that roster will grow. It may not be that there's a social worker if the person is living at home initially, but it may be that an occupational therapist or a physical therapist should be engaged, or a speech therapist should be engaged to help maintain ability as long as possible. I definitely recommend the occupational therapist and the speech therapist as they are needed. In my father's case, he was very conversant, but it was hard to hear. I mean, he had a lot of vocabulary words too, and he could comprehend and respond pretty well. However, he mumbled. He talked in a very low voice and he mumbled. And so we had, hey, you know, what did you say? And he would say, you need a hearing aid. And in fact, it was just that he wasn't enunciating his words. And when it was the occupational therapist that recommended the speech therapist, who did a world of good in doing exercises with him to help him increase his volume and enunciate his words. And she would do make him talk very exaggeratedly and in a very loud voice. And when he would settle into mumbling again, because inevitably he would, then we knew as his children how to help him, you know, go through those exercises again. And I mean, it would change him for half a day at least. He would be back to where we could understand him and really enjoy having conversation, because we could focus on what he was saying from a meaning standpoint, not hearing the words to understand the meaning.
That's a great example. Yeah, thank you so much. And then another question. So I'm always so struck by the impact on the caregiver physically, emotionally. I mean, that is so important to underscore. Take care of yourself in this process. And, you know, I think there is resistance for people with that. I know we talk about they may not have the time for self-care. I mean, self-care is hard for people who are not caring for other, you know, their family. I mean, in general, it's not something that's always natural to us, or we find reasons not to. So, you know, what are some of those barriers that people could be aware of, maybe self-imposed barriers, but what, you know, helping people who are in a caregiver position, you know, in addition to time constraints, what else do you see as coming up to prevent people from getting the care they need for themselves?
This is a great question. Thank you for bringing this up. There are some gender dynamics in play for females. Females tend to believe that they should be able to do it all, and do so, in a manner in which they excel. And dementia caregiving the demands of it are too intense to be able to do it all and do it all well. And female caregivers, another barrier is female caregivers tend to put themselves last. Mothers naturally put their children first, and not just humans. We see this in every form of living being, life that draws breath. Mothers put themselves last and put their children first. And although a person with dementia is nothing like a child, for reasons I won't enumerate now, that old role, those old habits, that muscle memory of care comes back. And so females are particularly positioned to take on too much and not admit that they're taking on too much, because they feel that they're supposed to excel in everything and do everything and juggle it beautifully. For men, historically, societally, are conditioned to not ask for help. They're the strong ones. They don't have emotions. That's not true at all. But men are not, still in society, it still can be taboo for men to talk about their emotions or admit that they need help. And these are constructs that are not true, but that we create for ourselves, and we tell ourselves that they're true. And I want to tie it back to that statistic. This is a cold and hard fact. For every person living with dementia, there are at least 2, if not 3, unpaid caregivers. That is the way it is in the U.S. And if any individual caregiver believes that they don't deserve to have other people on their team, other caregivers are managing somehow to have additional family members or other loved ones. Maybe it's a neighbor or a good friend of the person with dementia. It's statistically speaking, caregivers have at least some help, and so those that are reticent to ask for help should be comforted knowing that it's normal to have a team of caregivers. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, that's great. No, those are definitely other barriers that we forget about, and sometimes there can be a lot of guilt attached to wanting to take time for yourself, and but
let me say something about that, if I may.
Yeah,
we cannot provide our best care as caregivers until we take care of ourselves. If we're doing it all, if we're under that construct of I'm doing everything for my loved one, then do something for yourself, because ultimately that means that you're doing something for your loved one, because it rejuvenates you, it refreshes you, it makes you more patient, it gives you a greater opportunity for empathy. When you come into the caregiving room with joy in your heart because you've been able to pursue something that you love, that joy is contagious as well.
The classic airline mask, put it on yourself first.
Yes, a great analogy.
That's great. So I just want to end on one question to wrap it up. I want to try to end on a hopeful tone, because I think what struck me in this conversation is, this idea that once this is a diagnosis, there's a decline, and it may not get better. And I think I can see how that would really inhibit people from getting the help they need, or the diagnosis, or admitting what's going on. And I can only imagine how difficult that moment must be. But knowing that, what am I going to? Is it going to get worse? Am I going to get better? How should we frame that? And knowing that it often does not get better, what can we do to remain hopeful and find the joy where we can, and create new and even maybe closer relationships with our loved one through this? Like, how would you frame that for people?
Another great topic. First of all, let me stress that, and this goes back to the last talk as well about, the signals of cognitive impairment and signs of dementia and problems or loss of ability that people will may adopt as the progression ensues, is that Every case of dementia is different. It's as individual as a person's fingerprint. And so when we say that a person will lose the ability to remember who their spouse is at some point in the disease, that's not true all the time. That's a possibility, but it's not true. I also want to stress that in the individuality of each progression, a person can remain in early stage for many, many, many years. A person can enter into middle stage dementia and go back, have a surge, and go back into early stage for a period of time. And a person, generally speaking, with most people, the progression is so slow that a change from day to day is barely perceptible at all. And that loved ones can be there to support and enjoy and promote quality of life and laugh. I mean, some of the changes in dementia are frustrating, but others can be humorous too. You know, to share the joy that exists in every day, because if people are willing to accept, then they will find the joy that does exist in every day, even with dementia.
That's beautifully said. Thank you so much. And I know we've gone well over time, but I think it was a worthy endeavor to do so. Thank you so much for being with us again. Just so much wonderful, rich information and heartfelt communication of it. So thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back for the third installment, which will be, I wrote down, Monday, July 12th, from 12 to 1. And tell us what we can expect in that third installment.
Oh, you had to ask. I don't have that.
Oh, no, okay. Or maybe challenging behaviors that make.
That's right. That's right. It's going to be a talk about how to, well, I hate to refer to it as challenging behaviors.
Right. Sorry. Yeah.
It's what causes escalations that may occur as dementia progresses, and how dementia caregivers can help to de-escalate those situations which are symptom related, de-escalate those situations and restore a sense of calm and well-being and quality of life.
Thank you for clarifying that. So we will look forward to seeing you again in July, and others will join as well.
Thank you for the opportunity. And Robert, thank you so much for participating, and thank you for your great questions. I know that you have helped me answer some questions that others will have as well as they watch this recording.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Take care. Talk to you soon.
Wonderful to be with you. Thank you.